further ado, our first panelist is Nathan Andrews. He's at the University of Alberta as a graduate student in political science, but he's also the 2012 Trudeau Scholar and 2012 Vanier Scholar with several publications to his name.
Wow.
Our second panelist is Emma Malcolm, who is at York University. She was previously with UNRISD up until 2012 of May, I believe. She is doing her master's degree in development studies at York, and was also prior to that with the Friends of the Earth International in Ghana and Making Africa Work and the Health Development Initiatives. Our third panelist is Lalit Gunaratne, and he is here as our private sector spokesperson and speaker, for which we're all very grateful. He's worked for decades within the private sector, both in Africa and in Southeast Asia especially. He works inside companies trying to bring around mind shifts and different priorities within companies. So we look forward to his intervention. And finally, we'll have Chris Roberts, who's doing his degree at the University of Alberta, but he's previously worked as well with private sector, mostly as a consultant, and he was previously the VP in the West for the Canadian Council on Africa. So, with that, I will give over to our panelists.
Hello? I hope it's, oh, okay. I'm not going to be bending down this way, but I hope you can still hear me. I'm going to try to project as much as I can. I haven't been lecturing or teaching a class or something like that, so I don't know how to use these things. I'm still going to manage with it. My paper today, I'm just going to try to be very brief because it's basically a conceptual idea, but thankfully I was able to do preliminary field research between December and January. I basically did it in a few days, but I was in that area for that whole period of 2-3 weeks, trying to figure out what the companies are contributing to the specific community. So I'll talk about them, but I just want to give you a brief about what this particular paper is about. I finished my candidacy in December, so I was kind of thinking around the notion of corporate responsibility and what it means, because as of now there is no specific consensus on what it means and what it seeks to do, and most companies are now trying to really adopt, CSR in a very in-depth manner, if you like. But I find that some of them don't still really know what they seek to achieve overall when they talk about corporate responsibility. So that's what this paper is about. So from the literature review that I've done so far, I did find 5 key themes and 5 key reasons why I could say, or I could argue that CSR is deficient in the African context. And I'm talking about Africa broadly because I read African literature, but my focus is actually on Ghana. So some of the very specific insights will be coming from my experience in the Ghanaian context with the preliminary research that I did. So I'm just going to start off. So this is how the outline looks. First of all, what is CSR? Just very brief definition and explanation on what it actually means in the literature, and the main problem, what is the reason why I'm even standing here to talk, the methodology that I used for the very initial pilot study, and I'll also give the 5 reasons, because I have 5 reasons why I think CSR is deficient, so I'm going to state them, and then we'll look into, okay, what happens next? Should we just abandon the term CSR, or we can do something about it to make it efficient? And then we have my list of references. So what is CSR? Usually we think of CSR as, well, in the literature says though that it originated from the private sector itself. It dates way back into the Industrial Revolution period, and even during that time CSR seemed to be, companies trying to create washrooms for, the employees, and so it was more about employee-company relation as of that time. So that was what it meant. But even for outside the employee-company relationship, CSR seemed to be more of philanthropy. So I know some NGOs and some organizations received donations from several companies around that time. So it was more of, well, we have this money we want to give to support community work. So it was basically very philanthropic, and they didn't do it in a manner that is very concerted and that is very directed to solving specific problems. So it was basically, we have some leftover money within the company, so we can contribute to things that are being done by the society. So that's what the literature says. That's the origin of it. So thinking of it being originated from the private sector, it makes it a bit problematic to think of how it can actually grow to become an idea that tends to adapt to more social justice perspective. So that's where the problem starts. So the literature, as I said, dates back to, the concept dates back to several years, but also the literature itself dates back to the 1950s. It is a contested concept, but basically it deals with the notion of a philosophy about the relationship between business and society. If there is a business, how does a business relate with the society around it, and how do you deal with the people within the area that you operate? So that is the whole idea of CSR. There is also a growing commitment. As I said, some companies are really becoming more interested in the concept, and so they are adapting it to suit more sustainable development initiatives. And UN and other international organizations are adapting this concept to deal with their own priorities for development around the world. So that's also how the concept is gradually developing. This is one definition that I found that seems to be a bit all-encompassing, so I just thought I would cite. So it's a continuing commitment by business to behave ethically and contribute to economic development while improving the quality of life of the workforce and their families, as well as the local community and society at large. I find this definition quite, I wouldn't say complete, but it seems to encompass a bit of almost all of what you would think CSR to do. It's still lacking in some ways, but it kind of covers a bit of it because it deals with economic development. First of all, it's an ethical responsibility. It also deals with the quality of life of the workforce, because sometimes we think of CSR as the companies contributing to the community around them and the people without their workforce. You think that the workforce are already treated well by the company, so CSR could also be dealing with just the company workforce and how the company treats them. So that's also part of it, because the workforce will dwell in the community around the company. So it's really difficult to separate those two things, and that's a problem I've had with some of my committee members by trying to focus on community perceptions and not really thinking of workforce and how the workers think and or what the workers perceive CSR to be. But then we could have different focus when we're looking at that. What I find though is that there is scarcity of the literature on CSR. If you read CSR broadly, you realize that it's a lot of work has been done. Even in the African context, you find that South Africa is probably the country that has received a lot of work around CSR, and then Nigeria. But several other countries that are resource rich, that have several companies working there, don't have specific focus of the literature, because I wouldn't be able to explain, but I feel it is a problem, and because CSR is a crucial concept, it's a crucial entity in the business society relation, we should actually give it much more thought than we have done in the past. So that is also one of the key reasons why I think this research is essential. So the main problem is that, as I said before, while I think corporations have that responsibility to address the social and environmental impacts that would result from their operations, some of them don't really do it. And those who do it, they don't do it well enough. So it doesn't help the people that it targets. So at the end of the day, they have all these things they put together, band-aid, kind of solutions, and then it doesn't solve any specific problem. And later on, I think we could argue if companies are responsible to solving the specific problems within a particular country, that's a whole different argument. But I think that essentially, if you are a company and your work is impacting the lives of people, or if it's impacting the environment, it's impacting people's livelihood, then you have a responsibility to really deal with those issues. So that, for me, that's where I'm coming from. As I said, there's literature that shows that direct developmental impact of CSR is actually missing. So it's difficult to think of CSR really, yielding some sustainable development in the end. So this is the methodology. I went to Ghana. I went to 3-4 locations. So the companies I'm focusing on are Newmont Ghana Limited, and then Chirano Gold Mines. Chirano is owned by Kinross. Kinross is located in Toronto. So these are the two main companies. Newmont is American, of course, and Kinross is a Canadian company. So I went there and I just wanted to actually survey before I would develop my research questions. So I'm going to Ghana actually on Friday. Actually tomorrow, that's the point. So I'm leaving tomorrow through South Africa to Ghana to start my field work. So basically I did an initial study trying to figure out what is the general feeling out there. So I went on the street. I call it street survey. I've done a bit of work in journalism, so we call it Vox Pop. Basically, you go to the street, random sample, you just talk to people, 5 minutes or less or more. So we just basically test the waters and see what they are thinking generally around on the street as to what these companies are doing and how the companies are affecting their lives. So that's what I did, and I was able to talk to about 22 people because it was really very brief, short, survey. I could do all that within 3 days, somewhere in January. So that really gave me an understanding of where I should actually focus, and I mean what kind of questions I should be asking if I should go back now. So I'm going to go back and try to get it. And let me say that it's been really difficult to get the companies to cooperate. But I'm hoping to make some inroads as I go to Ghana. But it's a challenge to always try and work with the companies first of all. So this is the area basically that I'm looking at. So these are some of the areas where mining companies are located in Ghana, or gold is deposited and other minerals. But basically looking at these two areas, that Chirano, you can see Chirano on the left here, it's down, and then Ahafo is up there. That's where the Newmont mine is located. So these are the two locations that I'm basically dealing with. The others, I'm not dealing with them right now. I'm sure other people are doing research in those areas, so it will be useful to do that later on. All right, so reason one, I think CSR is deficient in the African context, basically because I think first of all, it is a Western construct. I say Western construct because it's originated from the West. We all know that. It's originated from this idea of big businesses being philanthropic to community organizations, or being responsible somehow for things that happen in the community. But then again, I say that also because the notion of CSR has been dominated by international organizations. There's literature that suggests that multilateral organizations have really taken hold of that concept and used it for several purposes. So there is an aspect of CSR that tends to focus on human rights. And I think if you focus on human rights, you would probably tend to lose hold of the fact that there is developmental issues that CSR could also be dealing with. So Fox's article will say that, well, the focus on human rights and the focus on all these other things that Western NGOs are interested in may not necessarily be what people in the African context or people in the various communities within which the mining companies operate will be interested in. So it tends to be a disconnect between the issues that UN may want to tackle and then the issues that communities may want to have addressed. I wouldn't say human rights is not one of them, it's of course one of them, but to focus on human rights alone and neglecting all the other things that CSR could contribute to really makes it deficient in that sense. I just cited this example. It probably doesn't speak well to the idea of a Western construct, but I spoke to this young man, and he just thought the company has been good because he has access to a swimming pool. It's interesting because I find the notion of swimming pool being used or being correlated with CSR very problematic. I don't think swimming pool is something that first of all is open to everyone in that particular location that he was talking about. It's only open to this people who belong to the mining company, like who work for the mining company, because he has his mother working with the company. So that's some of the perception. So these companies could go and construct all these little things, and they could be construed as CSR, but they are not. I think that it's not something that would be useful. How many people would actually go and swim there, and how many people are interested in using a swimming pool? What can you actually use it for apart from recreational purposes? I don't think it's something to deal with if you even want to talk about CSR. So that's a problem. But that was just one example that I thought would be useful. So as I said, there's also an aspect of CSR that makes it a Western construct. It tends to really focus on big companies, so multinational companies. But Fox is saying that small-scale enterprises in the various countries could also have some aspect of CSR, and they could also contribute to societal objectives. But then CSR as a concept tends to focus on these bigger companies, and so they lose track of all these other localized companies that could also be contributing. So that's where the notion is coming from. If you're not big, you're probably not expected to have CSR. You're probably not in that umbrella for companies that should have some kind of responsibility to society. So that's also a problem that could be addressed. Reason two, I say that CSR is lacking because, first of all, it has definitional problems. And I think that if you're not able to identify what it really means, you wouldn't really know what it seeks to do. So having a definitional problem, I think that in the social sciences, seriously. In the social sciences, there's no consensus on any concept at all. So that's going to be a problem. I can't believe I have only 1 minute. Anyway, so reason two, CSR is presented as a business case, and I think that is also a problem because you think that businesses have, you have to do something to really, benefit the community and not really do it because it's going to benefit you. I mean, I think you still want something to benefit you in the end, but you don't want to do it basically because it would have an impact on your profit margin. I think that is a problem that CSR has as of now. Reason four, it remains a voluntary act. We all know that, and so it is not legislated. You cannot have really hard laws around what companies should do, and that is a problem. UN Global Compact is trying, and all these other global regimes, but they are not strong enough to make the companies do any specific thing. So that is also a problem. I have all these quotes in here. I hope you're able to read them. Just skipping through. The last one is that it fails to incorporate the developmental needs of local communities. So they could go and build all these bridges and schools, but if it's not what the people need, it's not useful. No one is actually going to use them. Even if it's what people need and they don't engage with the people to identify that that's what they need, no one is going to take care of them if the companies leave the place, and it's going to be just sitting there, probably as things that will never be touched or things that will be misused. So I think that CSR should be able to directly incorporate the needs of the people and look at the context within which it operates before it can become useful. I think it should be more than a lip service, and websites are always nice with these nice words, but the company should actually take those proactive steps to engage with them. So thank you very much. I've been quite time-conscious. This one? All right, there you go.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so this is very much a work in progress, so hopefully I'll get some useful commentary. But I think Nathan finished off on a good part, just mentioning that a lot of CSR is just sort of website enhancement and so on and so forth. So I think it's a good sort of lead into mine. So the working title of my paper is Forms of Representation and CSR in Africa, Issues and Prospects. So, okay. So the aims of my paper are basically I wanted to explore how corporate self-representation vis-a-vis new media technologies such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. Sort of shape perceptions about multinational corporations, CSR projects, and also just generally their operations abroad. To look at how these media platforms offer various stakeholders both challenges and opportunities for kind of presenting what are, sort of competing truths between what a company says versus what a community says. about extractive industries in Africa, and to finally look at the implications for CSR practice in Africa. So essentially what I want to argue is that these new technologies sort of reshape the perception about what CSR is doing in Africa without actually changing the practice of CSR in any significant way. So I'm going to explain that. Okay, so I think you've kind of covered the CSR literature. Basically, the point is that there's this increasing importance of CSR for companies, and so for instance, like 80% of the top companies on the Fortune 500 list have a sort of CSR section of their website, or sorry, their website dedicated to CSR. So it's kind of become part of their broader marketing strategy. And this stems largely from consumer demand for more ethically responsible behavior. And in this way, consumers kind of act as like rewarding authorities for these corporations. So we'll continue to purchase your products and support your business if they sort of feel that their values resonate with those of the company. So this is the idea of a value identification connection between consumers and corporations. Okay. Losing my mouse. Okay. So basically, media platforms such as YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and websites, so on and so forth, have become this really important avenue for information sharing. And as consumers kind of have this unprecedented access to information, or to information about what companies are doing abroad, the self-representation, self-image of corporations also becomes increasingly important. But one of the things that I want to argue is that the information society is not equal and it's not neutral. So there are power relations within the information society, and therefore who has access to engaging in establishing their own image, how can small communities have the same resources needed to sort of counteract what a corporation is saying about their role in the community, for instance. So this sort of reinforces the fact that Westerners have largely been privileged in determining the virtual presence of Africa. So we've largely shaped images of Africa and Africans through new technologies. So this is sort of a reproduction of colonial narratives and this sort of salvationist discourse. But in this case, it's now companies instead of missionaries, for instance, coming in and helping sort of agentless communities. So I sort of, I'm bringing together a lot of ideas quickly, but I basically want to suggest that this sort of dominant self-representation of corporations is sort of contributing to like the governmentality of consumer conduct. So if we perceive that a company is acting in a certain way, this either brings us to action or inaction. And in the context of Africa, this is sort of been a large reason why I think a lot of pressure on MNCs working in the extractive industries there has sort of decreased over the past decade or so. So this also suppresses counter-narratives and sort of gains like possessive exclusivism over the truth. So what a community suggests that a company is doing, or what other advocacy groups suggest that a company is doing, competes with what the company presents themselves of their role in these host communities. So okay, I'm still good for time, right? Okay. Oh, crumballs! I went too far. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to argue is that they do this in three major ways. So I looked at Shell in Nigeria. I looked at their various YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and their website, just because Shell is actually, a very innovative company in terms of CSR, especially in terms of incorporating it as part of their marketing strategy. So I just sort of did a discourse analysis of what was on these various platforms. So, so first I'm arguing that through this, Shell is able to shift responsibility for some of the major issues in the Niger Delta away from themselves and onto both community groups and government. So, okay, this is my quick caveat. I'm going to say the word tweeted, and it sounds very silly, but that's what it is. So they tweeted, a number of times on the official Shell Twitter account about how oil is being stolen in Nigeria. There's devastation, environmental devastation caused by illegal refining and oil theft in the Niger Delta. So, and in some of their YouTube videos, which I don't have text from here, but in one of their YouTube videos, they say 80% or 70% of devastation in the region is caused by illegal activities. Well, that's not necessarily the full truth, right? So obviously, yes, illegal refining has caused damage, but it completely absolves Shell of their role, within environmental destruction in the region. So, and I also found this use of the word being stolen very interesting, right? Because it makes Shell seem like the victim of these criminals who have stolen from Shell. And I mean, it's almost comical to me, right? Because it obviously just completely eliminates the idea that, well, this oil is actually belongs to the people of Nigeria, so they're kind of just taking it back. But in this case, it's being stolen. Anyways, okay, so what this also does is sort of eliminates any counter narrative. So Scott 1987 talks about this idea of weapons of the weak. And I think in Amudia 2009, he sort of has this article about the changing phases of conflict in the Niger Delta, and he talks about how community groups went from a sort of more passive strategy of resistance, and now, after decades and decades of marginalization and deprivation, they've moved on to more aggressive, strategies of resistance. And one of this is sort of sabotage and oil thievery. So, but, through the presentation, through what Shell kind of describes, the image they present, this counter narrative sort of just becomes ridiculous. And if you just read, an advocacy group saying, oh, well, they've done this, this, and this, well, you'd sort of say, oh, they're being stolen from, so, they're right to engage with police or so on and so forth. Anyways, okay. So essentially, by shifting responsibility, I sort of suggest that Shell, rather than host communities, become the victims of thievery. But at the same time, Shell also becomes the agent of change and positive transformation in the region. So despite the fact that they have to deal with this awful thievery and sabotage and conflict and so on, they're still there. They're still contributing to CSR initiatives and so on and so forth. So Shell sort of takes on this almost like very good image. And so interestingly enough, they sort of claim to be the good neighbor. And so this is a huge sort of discourse, part of Shell's platforms is being a good neighbor in Nigeria. So these two quotes come from their website, but basically saying that Shell is very concerned with fostering and maintaining good relationships. It's very interested in contributing to sustainable development. It increases income in Nigeria. It's contributed $70 million. I mean, that's a huge number, right? So very much so you feel that Shell is indeed a good neighbor. It has done its part in helping Nigeria. So largely what they focus on, and as you review the different platforms, you'll see that there's a complete recognition of what are called positive affirmation duties. So, CSR sort of says that there's sort of negative duties that companies are responsible for addressing, and then they have their sort of positive contributions. So Shell is all about recognizing their positive contributions, but they make almost no recognition of dealing with their negative injunction duties. So they don't address, their role in terms of environmental destruction. Thank you. They don't address their role in terms of creating conflict, fueling corruption, and perpetual underdevelopment and increased poverty in the region. So you just sort of see the really good side of what Shell is doing. Okay, so one sec. The last sort of way that I think Shell uses these platforms to sort of shape perceptions is that to especially most of what I'm arguing here kind of is speaking to a group of people that are an audience that is probably looking at this from a less critical lens. So people take things for granted based on what they see. Something comes on a website and it sort of is truth to a lot of people. So the last thing I want to argue is that Shell sort of presents poverty as being a very accidental thing in Nigeria. So they completely separate the relationship between poverty and underdevelopment and oil production. They are completely isolated, isolated phenomena, and poverty is not at all a result of oil production, which obviously we know is not true. So it also, again, sort of reinforces this idea that, like, we don't know why Africans can't just get it together. It's not that there's actually companies there who are forcing them into poverty. So it completely eliminates this relationship, which I think is a very dangerous presentation of Africans and of Shell. So they sort of say, okay, well, we spend billions of dollars, and this is from one of their YouTube videos. We spend billions of dollars and we create jobs, we provide energy, but that doesn't explain why poverty has actually increased in the region, why underdevelopment has actually increased in the region. So, but through an uncritical lens, it just, again, sort of says, okay, well, why does this, keep happening? We just don't understand why Africa isn't developing the way it should be. So, are people buying this? Well, as far as I can see, they are. I mean, again, I'm just using these new platforms, but so for instance, Shell joined Facebook, and 93 days later, they had like 1 million likes on Facebook. And I looked at that was May 23rd, or April 23rd of 2012, and then I looked at this data on April 23rd of 2013, so a year later, they had almost 4 million likes. So within a year, they've jumped like almost 2 million likes on Facebook. And again, I know this sounds silly, but that's what we call it, likes on Facebook. So that shows a great amount of support, right? They have, over 12 million views on their YouTube channel, less followers on Twitter, but it's Twitter. So anyways, it shows that a lot of people are actually really, really supportive of Shell, and that people are really engaging with what Shell is putting on these platforms. So if 12 million people have seen Shell's YouTube videos, which suggest that, oh, well, all environmental destruction in the Niger Delta is caused because of illegal refining, well, that's 12 million people who now perhaps completely believe that. I mean, we can't assume everyone takes it as truth, but it's kind of convincing. Yep, I'm finishing up. So the kind of broader implications here is that in the case of Shell, at least, Shell's actually come, following their sort of voting crisis time, they've kind of rebranded themselves in a really effective way on these new platforms, and Shell is sort of now seen as like a leader in CSR. So within 15 years, they've kind of completely reshaped their image. So the consequence of this is that there's less outside stakeholder pressure, consumers, transnational advocacy groups, so on and so forth, to actually force Shell to rethink their CSR programming. So the perception has changed, but the reality really hasn't. So the beneficiaries of CSR in this case then become consumers who have a peace of mind because they have that value identification connection with Shell, and the corporation because there's less pressure. However, the reality for intended beneficiaries isn't actually changing in any fundamental way. So I think, just to wrap up, I think the point is that these new media technologies have been a very bad thing for Africa and a very good thing for Shell. And that's it.
Use the arrows.
Oh, you can use the arrows. Oh, okay.
Technology. technology challenges are for us.
Oh, is that? If not,
Right,
yours.
thank you very much. That was an interesting kind of precursor to what I'm going to say. I'm actually, even though I'm from the private sector, I'm not a real proponent of the private sector as a whole. I'm one of the private sector's biggest critics. I look at CSR and all this I try to look at it from a systemic point of view, from a holistic point of view. And having grown up in developing a solar energy, renewable energy business in South Asia and also working in Africa, I see that technology has done two things. Now, when I sold solar panels in South Asia, for instance, we found for our terms, because I'm from an urban area, I grew up in a city, the rural people, it seemed like an idyllic setting, and bringing them electricity and a connection to a TV, I knew cultures will change. And that's what has happened in the 25 years. Cultures have changed, people have changed, technology has really had a great impact in these rural areas. However, the industry has not really kept up with that fact. And their approach is still the same. So they're also using technology, as Emma said. Actually, I can't get away from the fact that both my parents were teachers, so you have industry still going in a very hierarchical way of running business still, top down. And we have society, on the other hand, rural communities still working in a holistic way, honoring the land, honoring the interconnected nature of things, and all that is now, so there's a clash that's happening between these two cultures. So how do we now work to bring these two cultures together? And that becomes a challenge. So how do we get the companies to compromise in this process? And that's what corporate responsibility seems to be about. However, companies are still run by a pathology of professions. So engineers, very left-brain thinking, MBAs, so highly trained to find efficiencies in the way business works. So there is no real training about the other stuff. So this is reason-driven, so nothing to do with emotional intelligence, no real values exercises, more for PR it seems. So that's the way this whole process is moving ahead. And of course there are people there are companies who are trying hard. So what I call an authentic approach to community engagement, authentic approach to CSR, and I guess mining companies is really at the core face of that, because mining companies appear in a community, and then if they don't engage with the community in a positive way, now their risks are going up. So from a Canadian context though, why it's really important is the fact that Canada is a leader in this industry. So if you put things in perspective, that's what we're looking at, and more. Indirect employment, about another 400,000 people in the mining business. And TSX, and the Vancouver Stock Exchange, finances about 60 to 70% of global mining investments. So Canada has a lot to lose if you lose this industry. So there are real challenges that are happening here. I was at the PDAC conference, the Prospectors and Developers Association conference a few weeks ago, and there were exploration companies. Canada is really entrepreneurial, so we have exploration companies. There were about 200 there marketing their exploration concessions, especially in Africa, waiting for investors to come with their money bags. And that was literally what happened 15, 20 years ago, to PDAC, or 50 years ago, 30 years ago. They came with bags of money, and sat with the concession, and they invested in the concession. No investors showed up this time. And there's a risk of losing about 50% of those concessions. And what Canada loses will be taken up by China, most probably, and other BRICS. And so that then opens up a whole new set of issues. So how do we deal with that? So often when I talk to mining industry, when I talk to investment houses, they say, don't regulate us because we don't need to compete with China. But really, with the way China operates, it's going to be a very, very difficult process to compete at that level. So the realities for the mining companies are at huge complexities on the ground. Africa is rising. There's resource nationalism as a result. And there are host community expectations that are so diverse. And we cannot look at Africa as as a whole. It's so diverse, as such a diverse country. Even within countries, there's so much diversity. So how do we get help the companies to understand those complexities on the ground? So there's artisanal mining, there's poverty issues. Then there are also other issues. There are political issues. There's thuggery, there's criminality involved in some of these activities. So there's a whole range of complex things that are going on. And for the mining companies, really, it's a real huge challenge that they face right now, and they're in a state of confusion. They really don't understand how to move forward from here. So that's the situation. So the level playing field is not there. There's a dearth of investments, so there are huge risks. And organizations like Mining Watch are doing a great job, I think, bringing this information to the surface, because Bill C-300, once again, was a bill that the industry should have not really been too scared of, because it wasn't going to take away too much. But the issue is this: the companies are scared of any regulation, because that regulation may hamper in their eyes in competing with the BRICS. So companies have, we have to also look at what companies start with first. They company with a legal license to operate. And the legal license gives them the limited liability company. So if we go back into the history of the limited liability company, it was started in the 1500s with the Crown investing in ships to go to the east to bring cinnamon and other goods. So they needed to get investors. So they got 10 investors for a £100,000 voyage at £10,000 a piece. And their liability was limited. So they didn't have to be liable if the ship sunk halfway along the way. So that, the legal license, the limited liability laws, when it came to North America, followed the freedom and liberty equation. So they have now, in the 1800s, there were court rulings where a limited liability company was deemed a legal person and a legal individual, allowing them to make political contributions, to lobby at the political level. Now, that was a turning point for industry. So if we think our politicians are running the world, that's not the case. So this is where the lobbyists come in. And this is how the mining industry really got together to stop Bill C-300 from coming on board. So those are fundamental things that we need to really lift the veil to understand where we stand in terms of the limited liability laws that are going on. So how do we will not be able to do anything with CSR until we change some of those fundamental issues, fundamental areas. In 1919, there was another court ruling in Michigan which basically said a company's sole purpose is to make profit for stockholders. So if you talk about legal license, in mining industry, you talk about going from legal license to social license. So that shift will only happen with an authentic leadership approach, nothing more. So this is going to be a culture that needs to be created based on value to move on to this side. So that's the way the industry works. But in terms of Canada, the Canadian government, realizing the risks that are attached to all this, put a plan together called Building the Canadian Advantage. However, because the Canadian governments also focus, the mono-focus they have on business and industry alone, it's fragmented. This approach is fragmented. We are not seeing the results that we really want to see from this approach, because they are not talking to a wide range of stakeholders. And this is what's happening too, refocusing CEDA alone for business interests. We have let go of development, poverty issues, HIV/AIDS, and a whole range of other aspects that create the framework, that create a grounding for us to go and do business with countries. We are losing a lot of goodwill out there. But that's happening because it's the industry-government nexus that's so close. And they're not seeing, they're not also allowing civil society space to come in enter the dialogue and deal with those other issues in a positive way. So in terms of some of the issues that companies face, to find solutions, they need to look outside the box. And now there are processes like FPIC, which is free and prior informed consent. In reality, we need to enable the community to say no if they don't want the mine to come. It doesn't happen that way. Usually the guns come in and move the community away. So how do we bring those things? How do we keep that dialogue going? And there's a clash of cultures that are going on between the ivory towers and the ground realities. So it requires quite a shift in terms of mitigating risk, because if you're at pre-compliance, you are now liable to scrutiny. So most companies operate at compliance, but going beyond compliance is what we're talking about here, getting social license to operate. And purpose and passion is then looking at leadership values and a vision driven by to make the business profitable. And that requires a shift in human behavior, a shift in leadership behavior. And that has to be a fundamental shift in the way we think about things, think about ourselves. And that goes back to a basic value of respecting people. And you spoke of internal to the company. CSR is actually integral. If you don't really respect your people internally, you're not going to be authentic to the community outside. So there's going to be a lot of cynicism within the organization if it's not a holistic process. So we need a radical shift in paradigm. Walking the talk based on values becomes an important part of this whole process. Because often what we are seeing is the cynicism that arises from what Emma just said about how we are out there in the public domain and essentially fooling people. But if you go down to the community level, you feel that people are still really upset, and that is the threat to the companies. Companies are going to get blindsided, and that's starting to happen now. So when an article appears in Globe and Mail, your investors are going to start thinking twice. So a couple of months ago, our Marshall Home Minister of the Home Affairs in Tanzania came and said these things, which are now becoming a truth for Africa. And he said building walls around a compound is costly, and that's really the case. So the risk, right now insurance companies and the others are trying to figure out what the amount, they're trying to quantify the risk. There's no way they can quantify the risk. It could be a $20 million lawsuit. It could be a $10 million wall around the compound. It could be hiring guns to guard your management to go into town. So a whole range of risks are there right now. So this complexity then requires a holistic vision from, especially from the Canadian government too, who is driving this now. So we need to separate business from commercial interests, clearly. We need to leverage all relationships that Canada had. Canada had such great relationships. Canada was leading in peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping, diplomacy. So without that portion of it, just approaching from a business angle, we're not going to win. We're not going to win, especially with China playing the game that they are playing. And there's such a lot of knowledge and information within Canada, the North-South Institute, CCIC, civil society has, and we need to reach into them. And then we need to also collaborate with countries like Australia, who have been really, really progressive in their approach. They're not running away from Africa. So we need to look at, and we have also lots of good practices up north. Rio Tinto created a process up in diamond mines up in Northwest Territories, where they changed the rules, and their engagement has been really positive. So we have a lot of good lessons that we can learn from within Canada. But even those lessons, the Canadian government unfortunately is reluctant to talk about because of other reasons, as you know, with Aboriginal affairs. So in my conclusion, what I say is we need to look at things in a holistic way. We will also see a sea change in terms of how business operates. Business will have no choice, because social license means sharing value. Sharing value means you're going to have to compromise on your profits. and how do you integrate all those things. That requires a shift in the way we lead companies, and that has to come through education. We need to change our education system to bring in emotional and spiritual intelligence into these programs. Talk about values and ethics and how they are integrated and interconnected. But if you still go to any MBA program here, even in Carleton, I looked at programs. There's MBAs don't have anything. They have a program called leadership and ethics, but they don't have any program that will embody a different way of thinking yet. So that's what's needed now, and we have to keep this conversation going. So I'm also very happy that you're getting engaged in this type of a critical conversation. Thank you.
Hi everybody, Chris Roberts from the University of Alberta, as you can see. My topic, if you read the online program that went out, the blurb, the abstract that was listed for this panel is actually the blurb that's for the roundtable tomorrow on Canadian foreign policy and radicalization in the Sahel. So there was a mistake there. It wasn't me. I sent in an abstract for this that was completely different than that. My focus isn't really either on CSR per se. I'm taking a much more macro view of where we're at today in terms of the whole milieu that's developed, especially over the last 20 years on African extractive industries. So if I say EI, that doesn't mean employment insurance, it means extractive industries when I talk. So this is an abstract of my abstract, just to make sure everybody's on the same page of where I was, what I wanted to talk about. I really wanted to talk about I wanted to look at the implications of what as you mentioned, resource nationalism, this current wave of resource nationalism, and this related focus on extractives for development that's really caught on since the African mining vision of 2009. It's not something new though, and we'll talk about that in a second. So can extractives drive African economic transformation? I would say yes, but, and we'll look at that. And is African jurisdictions, given that there's 55, depends on how you count, maybe 56, are the jurisdictional frameworks that are in place today capable of supporting this reawakened idea that extractives should be a panacea for economic development and socioeconomic upliftment? And this is where I'm a little bit pessimistic's the wrong word, but cautious. I've been working in and on Africa since the mid-1990s, and I was sort of always, promoting private sector development and missed opportunities and what the good things that were going on in Africa, even when people were looking at the bad stuff. But I am cautious about the direction some African states are taking with their extractive regulations after 25 years after sort of the neoliberal experiment had started. So my propositions are simple. Extractives are a hard test of institutions. I'm not going to get into the resource curse literature, the paradox of plenty literature. In fact, this builds on the discussion this morning where that was discussed by Peter Arthur and in our panel this morning, so I'm not going to get into that. But I think there's a different paradox in Africa today, and that's one of there's too much governance in one way. Not in terms of businesses saying that there's too much regulation, but there's almost too much governance because African states have all had to build up their regulatory capacities, whether it's policy, whether it's, let's say, geological surveys, mining, people in finance don't understand it, etc. So there's a lot of domestic stuff going on. There's regional initiatives. ECOWAS has tried to streamline some of the mining frameworks, mining policy frameworks across countries. So there's regional approaches. EAC, my case study that I'll talk about at the very end, is also trying to do that. And then all the transnational initiatives, everything that's, from the work that Ruggie has done, a lot of NGOs have done, companies have done on a collective basis, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's all this stuff going on in Africa, which makes it for a very complex environment. But still, you go on the ground in Africa and there's too little governance. There's too little capacity. The institutions aren't strong enough. You talk to mining officials who've been working in this for a long time, they say they're understaffed, they're undertrained, they can't do the complicated tax audits, they don't have enough people to manage the environmental risk assessment, EIAs, etc. And these are in countries that have been, like Tanzania, that have been far along this track of extractives. So there's all this stuff going on, and yet there's this mismatch between, there's lots of stuff going on, very complex dynamic environment, and yet on the ground, there's just still a bit too little governance. So for me, the other resource curse, so the resource curse is what we all think it to be, whatever. But the other resource curse for me, and this is what I'm seeing at the policy level in Africa, leaders especially, but the policy legislatures and even senior civil servants, is coming back to this common sense notion that resource-rich African states, whether it's mining, I'm particularly interested in extractives, so minerals and oil and gas, that because we have so much of this, this should be a panacea for development. And in my mind, that idea, which is commonsensical, is actually a precursor to the resource curse as we know it. And if you don't try and get out of that idea that it's a panacea, then you're going to end up going towards a resource curse. It's not inevitable. I would say it's never inevitable. But that is going to be an issue. So if you go back to the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of nationalization across Africa. I mean, you can name any country, even countries like Kenya had a national mining company, Nigeria nationalized the tin mines, et cetera, before oil in Nigeria. Nigeria was a tin producer, not known for oil until effectively the mid-60s. So, but the developmental state had its issues, and in the 70s, 80s, African states did start thinking about, well, look, we're still basically at enclave economies. We're still producing commodities at the very primary level without any processing. What's gone wrong? So if everybody thinks back to Lagos Plan of Action, you get a lot of this language about how extractives of natural resources, Africa being a natural resource-rich continent, are not being used for secondary processing. There's not a lot of ownership locally. There's not a lot of value added. So you get this language. You go back and read that. So if you read even Nigerian documents from the early 1980s, you see the same language. So this language was percolating that there had to be more local involvement and value added for resources to make a difference. But often what that meant is more and more state ownership, more and more command and control approaches to regulation and to management of that system. And what we've seen in Nigeria over 30 years is more, the creation of NNPC in the 70s. And as your presentation showed, I mean, Shell has been part of that development for 50 years. I mean, the Shell company in Nigeria is really a Nigerian company that's part of the whole Shell network. I have to admit, I still can't buy gas at Shell. I just don't, in Canada, I can't buy gas at Shell. I still can't.
You haven't watched the YouTube videos?
No, I haven't. I know too much, I guess. But then, so then we get the lost decade of 1980s. You get people called the neoliberal liberalization vision. In a lot of cases, started in Ghana, with both its structural investment policies and foreign direct investment liberalization that then really impacted specifically on mining, change of mining regulatory framework. So you've had about 20 years, though, across Africa, since about the early 1990s, the World Bank first mining strategy of 1992. It's part of this whole neoliberal vision. You have 20 years of liberalization across Africa in extractives. But as you saw, right around the time of the almost collapse of the Western economy, the African mining vision was published in 2009, which is African states saying, well, wait a second, we've seen years now of the super commodity resource boom, resource rents rising quickly, and we're still not getting the benefits of mining. We were promised by the World Bank that if we liberalized, extractives would be this panacea to development. I mean, that's not what the World Bank says if you read the fine print, but there's a lot of disappointment with all the efforts that have happened in African states, even those that didn't end up in conflict, that they weren't seeing the benefits. So the African mining vision, as well as other stuff happening in hydrocarbon industries, and the whole idea of resource nationalism, which wasn't just in Africa, it's been in Asia, it's been in Latin America, was sort of capsulizing the African mining vision, some of which reads very much like the Lagos Plan of Action, but there is a lot more nuance and there's a lot more thinking through the implications. And so since then, there's been all sorts of other international organization plans, and even the World Bank now talks about extractives for development. So one of the important things that the the African mining vision has developed is this idea that extractives are in the middle. To have it integrated into your economy, you need upstream linkages, side stream linkages, and downstream linkages. The problem is, still in Africa, African leaders, Museveni, I could name names, many of them, they really still think about minerals as, benefication is the benefits come from downstream value added. It always comes from industrialization, manufacturing, etc. And they don't necessarily see how really there's three different aspects to that. Just as an example of what's gone on just in the last 2 years, African Mining Vision comes out 2009. In the last 2 years, I know this is probably very big on a big scale there, but it just goes to show how many countries, the ones that are in yellow, are countries that are actually currently compliant with EITI, and a bunch of them have either been candidates, so they're moving towards EITI, or they have been suspended, and Sierra Leone was just recently suspended in the last few months, just for not meeting certain reporting requirements. So there's a lot of efforts going on, in terms of transparency, accountability, etc. But you also see major significant regulatory changes in the last 2 years in many countries. So you see that category. And then, as well, you still see political crisis, which is everything from, even in Mozambique, there's been little tiny bits of renowned violence. It doesn't make the press a lot, but even in Mozambique, which is held out as a sterling example of this, there's political crisis, and this goes right through to Mali, which has been one of the most significant political crises. So you still have a lot of political crises that are going to affect the political institutional frameworks of countries, as the times that the regulatory changes are moving fast down the route of what I would say the resource nationalism and value-added perspectives, which I think perhaps aren't thinking through how all these different areas are interlinked. So there's governance orientations. We talk about good governance, but there has to be a governance orientation of a certain state. I mean, is it going to be a private sector enabler, sort of the traditional, or the liberal viewpoint? Is there going to be a mixed economy? Is there going to be state-led development? Is there going to be, when you look at Zaire under Mobutu, that was a kleptocracy. There's no sense of that that's ever going to work. So then you have the institutional pillars, which is the governance competencies. But then I'm going to talk here specifically about extractive regulatory objectives. And this is where we get to the conflicting objectives of VI regulations. So on one hand, we all know about mitigation efforts. Regulations are about mitigating the effects. But there's two other conflicting objectives. And one is you want to have a vibrant mining sector where you're finding and discovering and developing resources. And you also want to have a catalyst. You want to use these resources as a catalyst for economic structural transformation. But there is some contradiction there. Because if you want a big mining sector that's promoting more and more mining so you can find value for those minerals and have as many resource rent streams as possible, you're not going to do the same regulatory framework as you are if you want to use them for a catalyst for economic structural transformation in terms of industrialization, in terms of mandating that companies that mine have to refine to a certain degree, because that will restrict the level of mining, because certain companies won't do that, and the costs go up. But you also have the biggest contradictions between value maximization, catalyst for economic structure, and mitigation efforts. The more you have mining and extractives, the more mitigation you have and the more governance impact. And as if you have economic growth in general, no matter which way you're going, you have governance capacity that you need versus growth. The faster these sectors are growing, the more you need governance capacity. A refinery, you could argue, is a catalyst for economic structural transformation. You're converting crude oil. But a refinery needs a whole set of regulations that you don't even, that are different than if you're doing upstream production, for instance. So there's costs and benefits to both approaches to extractives. I'm not going to get into the extractive value pyramid, but I'm willing to talk about that afterwards. This has a lot to do with how certain countries develop mining at different phases. So lastly, I want to just talk about the EAC, which is currently going under, regional integration efforts. They're slow, they're sluggish. There's some hope. There's some drawbacks. It really is not a common market, even though they want to be a common market. But in the EAC, they are starting to look at, well, how can we coordinate all our growing mining sectors so that we can boost both regional integration and we can boost the value-added impact of our, everything: iron, coal, steel, tin, etc. So if you look at, but the issue is, and I've been working on this is a consulting project I'm doing, when you sit down with these mining officials, you realize that the idea of regional integration always is subsumed under presidential dictates of what needs to be done. So for instance, Uganda, surprisingly enough, has had the first iron ore smelter in the region, a small one, Indian technology, but a local company, it wasn't an external company, but an Indian, Asian-linked company. So they're actually doing an iron ore smelter with local iron ore and imported coal from South Africa until the coal sector in the region gets done. But Kenya is planning a big-scale steel industry. They already have land set aside. They want to have the regional iron and steel complex. But at the same time, now that Kenya wants to do that, they stop, in certain contexts, they won't export coal to neighboring countries, and the iron ore exports have stopped. So in a lot of cases, you're getting cross purposes because people are so, extractives have to be smelted, they have to be processed, and that's what development means in the extractive sector. And I think that's not what the African mining vision and some of the post documents, later documents were talking about. Then you have gas and oil and gas developments. Uganda, Museveni wants a 250,000 barrel refinery near Kampala. Uganda uses, on a good day, 30,000 barrels a day, max, in terms of everything is operating efficiently. And that is holding up oil and gas development. It's actually causing a lot of dislocation because of the size of this facility. So 8,000 families have had to be moved, etc. And so these are all hard policy choices, but sometimes they're not made with either the local community, the national interest, or the regional interests fully thought out. And then I'm going to talk about the Great Lakes here just briefly. We've had a collapse of the Great Lakes mining industry, and everybody would say that, through Dodd-Frank and what's that, section 1502 we talked about earlier today, that they're stopping conflict in Congo and use of conflict minerals. But what it's actually done is there was a vibrant mining sector in Burundi, Uganda, and especially Rwanda, which is basically stopped because they're part of the certification schemes. The certification costs a lot of money. And I could ask me about it later if you want to hear about how it actually works. So in terms of even having a mining sector and value added in tin, tungsten, and tantalum, that's not even an option right now for the EAC. And so now we're talking about Tanzania has just approved its first uranium mine, like just in the last week. Uranium mines are a whole other issue. I mean, there's, in terms of the environment, in terms of even geopolitical issues. But both Uganda and Kenya are actually pursuing the nuclear power option. They're so power short, they're actually pursuing this seriously, even if people outside aren't taking them seriously. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the region of the EAC, which is not necessarily well thought out and well planned out, but it's going to have significant impacts both on local communities, on regional integration, and even on the nature of future investments in those countries, because some of the policy approaches they're taking are going to skew the extractive sectors in ways they haven't fully understood. That's just a quick and brief, dirty overview, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
But now I don't have it in front of me. So I'll just give a little bit of quick feedback then before I get into questions. We have quite a bit of time for that, so that's good. The first one, which I actually was going to be towards Nathan here, is the types of companies that you're looking at. Really make sure that you look through a lot of those, especially if you're looking at the difference between hiring practices and other services for employees, because obviously there's going to be different types of employees for different work and how much training they'll need already in advance, things like that. So that's something you might want to bring up in your presentation. Same thing as well for, for Emma, which is the YouTube link. So it's interesting that they got that many views. I'm intrigued as to how many likes on YouTube they got. Because, I mean, I've watched the videos. That doesn't mean that I've bought in, or that I'm agreeing with everything that's said in the videos. So sometimes that's a little nuance that's good to bring up. Lalith, I'm not sure that lobbying is as powerful here as it is in the States. I certainly have a couple friends who are lobbyists or ex-lobbyists, and I can tell you that in some cases it's really a hard slog, and they sometimes have nothing to show for thousands of dollars that are thrown into things. That can be good and bad, depending on how we're looking at it, because NGO lobbyists are also hitting brick walls, so it works for both sides. Chris, I was going to try and get you the study, but I don't have it anymore, which was, again, for the 3 Ts. One of the issues with the coltan, tantalum, which are the same thing, trade, is actually when it was looked at, a lot of the NGOs were fighting against this for iPods and iPhones, but actually 80% of the supply chain wasn't even coming from DRC at all.
Maybe 5 or 10.
Exactly. DRC was maybe 5 or 10%, which, again, is an issue, and we should be trying to cut down on illegal mining, however that's done. But it certainly comes up in a lot of these policy debates as well. How much data do we actually have behind what we're advocating for? And what are the other options? If they're not going to be mining, what are the other groups going to be doing instead to get funding? Which, of course, is a scary prospect. That brings us into something that nobody brought up, which was Central African Republic. Nobody brought it up in this discussion. Nobody brought it up in the last discussion, which certainly comes up especially for governance issues of natural resources. So we hear a lot about great country examples, and then people will skim over the bad ones, which certainly have impacts. And with whatever the new government will be, it'll be interesting to see what they decide on that. So with those, I open it up to questions, and feel free.
I have a question, comment. Am I allowed to give one? It's not about my own
Sure.
thing.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Speak loudly, though.
It's for Nathan. I was just thinking about the idea of CSR as a Western construct, and I was thinking about just an idea that you can consider is that CSR is partly coming from this idea that like corporations are now they're being thought of as like citizens of society, right? So when considering, how it's a Western construct, what I would try and look at is differing conceptions of citizenship and how that sort of shapes what the corporations see their role of as citizens in Africa versus what Africans see or understand as the idea. So that was it. That's all.
Well, that's an interesting point. Thank you for that. I think I had a point in the slide that spoke about the dictionary definition of a corporation, which looks at it as a legal entity. And so then it's really more of an oxymoron to think of a legal entity that does not have an individuality being ethical. So I think that's a really good point. I could look at it from what does it mean to be a citizen in the African context, and does it apply to corporations? Yeah.
Great. So then I'm going to go to you. Yeah.
I have a couple of comments, but first of all, I wanted to thank you all for a really, really interesting session. It was very exciting to hear, and to speak louder, about your different perspectives. And because I'm sort of interested in this coming from my research in Africa, but also looking at public perception of the industry and the use of CSR in promoting, for example, the nuclear industry in Ontario. Seeing it come together, it was very fascinating. Thanks for that. And so my comment for Nathan is that I really think, I may not have understood you correctly, but maybe you should think about what you understand under CSR, because in some ways you could see it as a public promotion strategy, as in the second presentation, or you can see it really as this corporate philanthropy and this undertaking of sort of doing good in society. And I think often that's not really how companies would perceive that. They really see it more as achieving the social license which you were talking about, getting the support from the community, but usually not with a lot of emotional investment. It's usually about giving money to keep people, at least in the nuclear industry in Ontario, it's putting money into things which make a company look good, like into the sports club or into the local clinic or into the local hospital. And this will happen maybe even in the African context, and it may be a useful contribution, but I would be interested in the motivation, if you could tease that out, what the motivation is for CSR. And a question or comment, or it's a question for you, is really what would you foresee is going to happen with this new strategy to channel aid using mining industries in Africa? So you see their big announcement a few weeks ago now that all Canadian aid is channeled through the extractive industries or mining industries. And you yourself said also that actually they don't really know how to do those type of things. And how does that fit with the lack of knowledge? And you talked about the loss of all the knowledge which actually exists already, which is now undermined. What are your ideas of what's going to happen with my question?
Okay, well, I think there's still a lot of confusion as to how that's going to be taken forward too. So even in talking to organizations like Boost and all that, I mean, they're very careful not to even answer questions at the moment because it's such a controversial issue at the moment. So, well, talking to people, I mean, I was speaking to a couple of diplomats from Africa, and they said, well, Canada has stated their case. So now we know that they're not interested in our development, but they want to now do business with us only. So on one hand, they have been very transparent in the way they are approaching, just like China. China says, look, we're not interested in anything else. This is economic development, this is money. What you do with your country is your business. So there is that shift that seems to be happening too. So on one hand, there is a big stick that comes with money to the developing world. So that may be shifting. So I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. However, there are countries still that need support. There are countries still that I think could benefit from help in certain areas. So just sort of getting away completely from that can create problems with understanding.
Hang on. Sorry, Nathan, did you have any input for what's brought up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a suggestion, and I think I'm going to take it and look at it because what I'm going to do for the 3 months field research is actually to look at what does it mean to speak of CSR. So I'm going to ask the community members. I don't want to go and impose my understanding of CSR on them. I really want to go and listen to what they think CSR means to them. And I find it difficult though that whenever you start talking about what CSR means, they start thinking of impact. My notion of CSR is more of, it's less of impact. I mean, impact is part of it, but then immediately they start talking about the company hasn't done anything for me. So that is a perception too, but I think I want to really get to the cracks of what the notion itself means to the people, and then the companies themselves, but they speak about it on the websites and everywhere, but what does it really mean? So I'm trying to really understand the discourse of CSR. Thanks for that.
Chris, Emma, did either of you want to make a comment on this? Neither was directed. Okay. All right then, I'm actually going to go with him, and you can too. Okay, good, perfect. Go ahead, sir.
The idea that 1 million people have looked at the Shell website is important, in spite of the fact that you say you're not convinced. This is the whole idea of marketing, that they're marketing themselves. That's why they take out an advert in the local daily newspaper or TV and so on. So it's important. And they are making an impact. They're packaging themselves in a way that is fascinating people, which is why people are looking at the website and telling other people go and see what Shell has done on YouTube or whatever. So that is something important. I think there's a lot of information about the context of mining in Africa that was in the last presentation. And anybody interested in CSR to the extent that it relates to the extractive industry would do well to look at the policies and the strategies that this gentleman presented in the last presentation. And actually I want to talk to you because as a person setting out on Friday, tomorrow, to go and do research, I think you need to, a sort of a crash program to prepare yourself as a bit better. you talk about a box pop approach. You're asking people what, and I'm asking myself, if you're on the streets of Ghana asking people about corporate social responsibility, what are you telling them and asking them about? Because I assume that the average Ghanaian will not understand corporate social responsibility in English, so you have to translate it into something. And that for me suggests that you have an idea of what corporate social responsibility is, even though you say you don't seem to understand it. I think these presentations give you a conceptual framework, especially of what corporate social responsibility is. And these two presentations give you an empirical framework of what corporate social responsibility does. And for me, instead of belaboring what it means, what you could well do with the two mining companies that you want to go and interview is to ask yourself, what does policy say about mining? What are the aims of Ghana in terms of mining? How should it contribute to development? What do those two companies say they want to do about it? And therefore, how does what they want to do about mining in Ghana add to what they themselves tell you is corporate social responsibility? In fact, when you say that you have a problem interviewing people, that is part of their marketing, and any PR person in any company, any information office and so on, will tell you hundreds of things about what their corporate social responsibility, what their perception of corporate social responsibility is. So what you can do is to run like that. Just to wind up, my first exposure with this idea of corporate social responsibility involved the largest mine in Kenya, whose workers went on strike. And the reason why the workers went on strike, the tellers, the cashiers, is because they wanted a medical scheme that covered their spouses and their children. At that time, the medical scheme only covered the worker himself. Typically, 80–90% of the workers were men. So the wives and the children are not covered. And these people are saying that the people who fall sick in the family are the wives and the children. So we want a scheme to cover those people, even if you leave us out as the men. And the company refused. And then through the deliberation, the arguments, they discovered that there was a veterinary insurance policy for the pets of the general manager of the company. So the workers asked the company, you mean you can insure the pets of the general manager, but not the families of the workers? And so the workers went on strike. And that led to a whole lot of things. But, so when that company, the bank, being a commercial bank, goes out to do corporate social responsibility in the community, but is not even looking after the families of its own workers, then what is that corporate social responsibility about?
Any of the panelists want to comment?
I could comment on that. So I do have a definition of corporate responsibility. As part of my proposal, I was supposed to operationalize the various definitions that I've read and come up with my own. I still find that problematic because I don't think researchers should go to the ground with a clear definition and impose on the people. And I understand your point as to how it will be difficult to translate corporate social responsibility into the language, the local language, and that's what I realized. And I realized that whenever I start speaking of it, it ends up being what is it that a company should be doing for you. So that's how I translate it, and I think it kind of touches the basics of corporate social responsibility. But that's a problem I'm going to have, and I don't know. I cannot translate it literally into the Akan language, which is the dominant language for those areas. But I'm going to try. So the basic question would be, what do you think should be the company's role in your community, or the company's impact or something like that? So it will still boil to impact, but I'll try and direct the question to more of the specifics about their responsibility. What are they expected to do? What are they supposed to be doing, being in your community? So it's difficult to translate, but that's how best I can approach it.
Okay, other questions? Sure, green shirt. Sorry, I don't know your name. Feel free.
I'm Caroline Sequel from McGill University. Well, I really enjoyed all of your presentations, and thank you for this important panel. It seems to me that a contradiction in CSR is really the contradiction that mining needs so much land and it needs so much resources. It's highly land intensive, when this is also the asset that people need the most as well. So you have this mismatch, which you spoke about, that they're building schools, they're building hospitals, but people are using their land. So, I mean, this just seems to be like there's never going to be real corporate social responsibility if we don't address this huge contradiction, the fact that people need to use land, not just for aesthetic reasons or for their cultural values. We spoke about cultural, religious, and spiritual perspectives on land, but not uses of land. And this is going to constantly run up against each other, which is why we might be seeing more of a focus on, sports and CSR rather than land use or agriculture or something. So how do we reconcile that, which seems to be it really hits the core of what, at least in my research and I guess what people are really having grievances about?
Sure. Before I went, gentlemen, and you get the last question. Go ahead.
This is related to this presentation, especially that last speech about. I'm saying this is related to this presentation, especially that last speech about the contradictions between infrastructure ambitions and the prospects for integration. But I thought it could work the other way around, given the fact that infrastructure ambitions are one thing and the capacity to finance them is quite a different thing. My understanding of the problems is that actually the middle countries, much as in rhetoric, they want like huge refineries and other projects. They're finding difficulties in generating the finances to actualize that, and that is pushing them towards more kind of collaborative projects in infrastructure planning. So I think it could also work the other way, that when the limits of resource nationalism, especially in terms of finances, become a reality, then they realize that actually they don't really have to collaborate on some of the infrastructures.
I hope so, but I'm worried for two reasons. One is, compared to even 5 or 10 years ago, the different sources of financing available today that aren't, they're not market-driven and or they're off the books or they're elite negotiated, which is really back to the 60s and 70s, creates opportunities for governments to do these big infrastructure projects that companies won't do. So that to me is one concern, because that reminds me of a lot what happened in the 60s and 70s. I could list a whole bunch of different examples. And I'm talking not just about China, but China is one, in terms of the money they have available to do big projects in Africa that often are loans. They're often not grants. People don't realize that. So that's one issue. But the other issue is, if right now the financing environment for big, I'm not going to say infrastructure, but for big extractive industries, upstream or downstream projects is incredibly tight, as you mentioned. But right now, nobody wants to put money into these sectors. So that discipline that you're saying that maybe the market would provide to some of these leaders is kind of absent. And in a lot of cases, the African leadership are being they're reasserting themselves after being somewhat, beaten down for a while with liberalization. And now there's a lot of reasons, and I outline it in the chapter, there's a lot of reasons why they have that option. And the China thing is just one of, I outlined 6 reasons. Having a China option is one reason. So, and one of the reasons is elections. So the democracy, I mean, you have an authoritarian electoral system, but democracy causes a lot of pressures on leaders to say, we're going to deliver big projects. So you are getting that in these places like Kenya, and the last election was full of interesting manipulation of a mining bill that was previously approved, and it changed right at the end before Parliament legislature got thrown because of upcoming elections. And Museveni sort of hung his hat on this huge refinery. And some of these guys, I mean, it's electoral politics to a degree. So, I'm not saying democracy works and it's ugly, but it's another reason why resource nationalism is taking off across Africa, because election systems are somewhat working against sickness. So I'll leave it.
Any of the other panelists want to make a comment?
To your question there, yes, certainly land use is a big issue there. So, especially in the north too. This is one of the questions that are, as you know, coming up in terms of how you use land. But it really goes back to this mining, oil and gas, and tobacco, those industries have those inherent issues which requires industries for themselves to be much more aware of those challenges. So what we are driving at is how do we bring in some basic human values to operate based on respect. So a respectful engagement with the community, first of all. At the first stage of the business, so when the geologist goes into a town, into a village, that engagement really sets the stage for what's going to happen in the future now. Before, people were not as assertive. Now people are assertive. They come around and say, who are you? Where are you from? Why are you here? So you need to then understand what the needs of the community is by sitting across the table, not flying in and bringing in. And the other day I was actually speaking to Martha Evans, who's the counselor for CSR, and she said, a lot of companies have spent a lot of money building schools, building hospitals in communities, but still people are not happy. So you ask that question as to, okay, well, do they have a relationship with these people? Are these people flying in and doing all these things? They cut the ribbon and take lots of pictures and walk away, and these people are saying there's no relationship based on mutual respect. And I think that's, so you don't have to spend millions of dollars to create that, create a relationship with what I say, a true partnership. Now in the north, one project where they engage with the Picho community and the Dene community up front. And they came and said, look, we don't want you messing around in this area because there's a burial ground there. So the company honored that. It's a simple request they made. They honored that and they preserved that area. So, and that was an extra cost to them, but they honored it. So that's the kind of engagement based on respect, mutual respect that we need, I think.
Great.
Can I just throw in two last comments? I always have to have the last word. No, but just two things, two examples of what you're saying. I mean, mining is problematic, and it's turning geological assets into economic assets, and it's always a dirty business. So, I mean, there has to be regulations to control that. But for instance, in Tanzania, talking to mining officials there, Barrick Gold was going to sell its subsidiary, African Barrick, which has 4 large gold mines in Tanzania, to the large Chinese gold firm. I forget the name of the gold firm, China Gold or something. And I'll tell you, local communities and the Tanzanian government was not happy. And it has a lot to do. I mean, despite everything that we say about the Canadian mining companies or Western mining companies, their policies on HSE, on meeting their commitments, etc., is still way higher than some of the other operators out there. And so there was a big sigh of relief when that deal didn't go through. So I'm not saying that Barrick is great, I'm not by any stretch, but I'm just saying that we have to be cognizant of that there are better players that can always get better, and there is a difference between different players out there. So,
Great. So, okay, on that note, thank everyone for showing up. I hope some of you are going to the evening events, and see some of you tomorrow. Good luck on your flight.
Thank you.